All right, we are going to go ahead and get started, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to today's workshop on Ransomware 101. So every insight and tool you need to play defense. We are excited about this topic because of course it's a very relevant, discussion for today. It's no surprise, from Accenture and Kia Motors to CNA Financial and Acer tech company, businesses big and small are just feeling all of the impacts of the ransomware attacks that have been happening as of late. And then adding fuel to the fire, supply chain risks especially are at the forefront of cybersecurity threats today. So these recent high profile attacks like Colonial Pipeline, Kaseya, all of those just continue to outline even the greater significance and impact that these attacks can have on supply chains and the need to address these important vulnerabilities. And so everyone is paying attention to this, and of course, so should you. Now, before I dig into this, I want to do a few quick introductions so you know who you're hearing from today. So I'm Dr. Christine Swalcourt, your main sort of host for today's session, which is sponsored by MSP 360. A little bit of background on me. I've been in the cybersecurity industry for about a decade now, leading a variety of different cybersecurity functions within the Fortune 100 space. I also earned a PhD in security engineering, and today I am the CEO of Cyber Pop-Up, which is a next generation cybersecurity services company. We also have joining the conversation later on, Rolando Lopez, who is a global security leader, who will share more on his experience with dealing with real ransomware attacks and some of the lessons learned and experiences there, which will be a really good conversation for us to have. And then we'll also have Seth Hartness, who is from the MSP 360 team, and he'll talk through some super tactical and viable options and features that can be used to combat a lot of the threats and risks that we talk about during this session. Now, we have a full agenda today, and so we're gonna jump right into it, but just as a quick overview of what we'll be covering, we'll do a quick intro to ransomware to ensure we're all on the same page and just level set on some of the happenings there. We'll talk about key trends and insights and how things have evolved over time. Then we'll get into a discussion around recent attacks. Specifically, we'll dig into Kaseya a little bit more, since that's one of the super prominent and I think relevant ones for this audience especially. Then we'll get into a fireside chat with Rolando, like I mentioned, who has a ton of experience responding to cyber attacks, including ransomware. And then we'll get into your ultimate toolkit for defense and all of the things that you can do to address some of these risks, followed by that overview of MSP 360 with Seth. Now, note a couple of things. One, we are giving away a Sonos Play 5 at the end of the session, so be sure to, of course, stick around and see if you are the lucky winner for that. It's an awesome prize. And then last thing, as Kurt mentioned in the beginning, feel free to drop questions in the chat area. We'll keep an eye on those from time to time, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can during the workshop. Don't feel the need to wait until the end to ask questions, right? Ask them in real time. We'll keep an eye out for that, but we'll also try to leave some time at the end to answer questions as well. Awesome. Okay, so we are going to jump right in. I have my chat open so I can see you all. Again, make sure you're post in any questions that you have. So jumping right in with a quick intro and overview. So the bottom line from a trends perspective, first starting with 150% increase in ransomware attacks over the last year, is that of course attacks continue to grow. Like, that's not a secret or in use today. These attacks happen every day. It's so common that you even see trends like ransomware hostage negotiations careers soaring. So people are out here looking for professionals who can help them negotiate with these attackers in order to get access to their data back. And so just interesting, like how these trends and growth start to impact other areas. But this, as a lot of people know, this growth is influenced a lot, at least of recent, by things like the increase in remote work over the last couple of years, and things like users really enabling more of these attacks, and the increase in attack surface as a result of that, which we'll dig into more in a little bit. But another interesting stat just in terms of growth, IBM's team reported that ransomware accounted for 25% of all of the breaches that they encountered in the last year. So definitely a rise there. Another interesting number, not surprising, but just something to definitely know, the average demand is 170K, but we've seen in examples like the Kaseya attack, which I'll talk about more later on, but that one went up to 70 million, right? And so these price tags can be really high, but it's also not only about the ransom, right? When you think about it, it's the ransom plus the cost of operational impact, plus the cost of data recreation if it's lost, and everything in between. And so different financial elements to consider there. But another element, one report showed that operators of some ransomware variants actually determine the ransom demand based on the victim organization's revenue. And that was ranging anywhere from 0.08%, which is a lower number. But if you're looking at companies that have really high revenue in the billions, that can still be a pretty considerable number, all the way up to almost 10% of the victim's annual revenue. And so they're really being intentional about how they determine the ransoms to get the greatest chances of payment and to make the biggest bang for their buck, essentially. An example that ties this all together, the Atlanta city government, spent over 17 million to recover from a ransomware attack that was demanding 52,000 in Bitcoin. So they ended up spending way more to recover than the actual request. But it was, a necessary, cost to spend to, again, recover from that attack and regain access to their systems without falling victim to or bending to that demand. And so I think that's a key indication that managing this is expensive, especially if you're not proactive, which I'm sure is, why many of you are here today, right? Is we need to be way more proactive with how we address these threats. There's also, trends around companies creating Bitcoin reserves as backup, just in case for payments and things like that. So all kinds of crazy things or interesting things going on from a finance and money standpoint when it comes to ransomware. Another thing on the cost side is the cost of damage is growing consistently. So we've seen 2 times growth almost over the last year. It's estimated to reach 20 billion by the end of this year. And the one thing I'll call out here is we haven't seen that kind of rapid 2x growth since the jump from 2016 to 2017, which signals that we're catching another growth wind, because around that time is when this really started to get on the radar and become a bigger issue for companies. And we're seeing that kind of large jump again here. And there's a couple of reasons why we're seeing that happen, and we'll dig into that in a second. But before we do, a quick question. Would love to get folks from the audience to just chime in on this. What country do you think is the most targeted when it comes to ransomware? And feel free to just pop your responses in the chat here, and I'll just keep an eye and see what we have. We have so far all US. Yeah, that would be, we have one for India, a couple for India, between India and US, it looks like, are the main components. Okay, thanks y'all for sharing your opinions. Yeah, definitely. This one kind of caught me by surprise too. Initially, I would have thought the US as well. The answer is, quite honestly, to a certain extent, it's based on which report you're looking at, right? Different people have different sets of data, but generally it's been an arm race between India and Indonesia. I see one comment saying it could be, Russia or Ukraine, depends on source versus target. And so yeah, definitely tons of different opinions and perspectives out there. But The reason being, first for some of these, so local experts in, India, for example, are saying that it's due to the high level of domestic ransomware in these areas, and it's leading to a situation where Indian adversaries are targeting Indian organizations, almost forming sort of a civil ransomware war within. And so that could be one reason. Also, there's just been a lot of changes in attack behavior, where attackers are switching to more targeted attacks that rely a lot more on human enablement in order to bypass organizations' defenses. And so places where there may not be as much attention on sort of the human element of cybersecurity and training and awareness, which is a challenge for every country. But areas where that is not so much, you tend to see higher impacts and so on. So yeah, definitely different opinions and things there, but the places that are being attacked, there no country is exempt, right? But we see some higher numbers in some cases. Now, just to level set here a bit, I'm sure most of you are familiar, but I'll just do it again just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So sometimes referred to as digital extortion, right? Ransomware is an attack method where criminals are basically hijacking access to the prized digital assets of an organization, and they're demanding payment for restored access. And so over the last decade, there's been different variations of these attacks that have been introduced, but the consistent sort of end game is usually to just extort an organization out of money or out of resources. And so, for example, an attacker might encrypt all of your data with private keys, right? And then ask for that payment, typically in Bitcoin, in exchange for a decryption key. And without that key, of course, or proper backups, you simply just can't access your data. Now, one of the most common ways that this gets into organizations is through user error. So employees tend to click on phishing emails that include malicious files that give these attackers unauthorized access. And it's as simple as that right therein. But to make matters worse, there's advanced, ransomware variants that don't just get in and, blindly just sort of encrypt or lock up whatever they see first. There are malicious kits that are steered by hackers to basically explore the network in silence, looking for data that, when it's locked up or when your access is revoked, will really hurt you and your company the most. And they find that and then attack, because there's no use in encrypting some old server with old data that nobody cares about, right? It's like they want to impact the data that will bring your operations to a halt, because that is when you're more willing to pay up the ransom. And so that's definitely been a trend. But adding to the fire is the fact that a lot of the more advanced variants or operations take that a step further. So knowing that a common method for defending against ransomware attacks is to create backups of your data that you can easily restore from if infected, because that's important, right? Operations are now, looking for those backups on the network and trying to infect those as well, leaving the most prepared companies in bad shape if you don't have a very strong and robust backup strategy in place that can account for those kinds of things. And so ultimately, these kinds of attacks just impact all areas of the business. When you think about the three pillars of cybersecurity and the need to basically protect confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, right? That's the CIA triad. And this just touches on all of them, these trends, because it's like, from an availability standpoint, right, you no longer have access to your data and the systems that you need. There's trends where, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit as well, but they threaten to leak data and expose data, which also impacts confidentiality. And then finally, when your data is being encrypted by all kinds of janky and shady tools, this can impact the integrity of data even when you try to pay and decrypt that. And so this really impacts all areas of cybersecurity. And so Very important thing to note. Now, just a quick rundown on the two types of ransomware approaches. There's countless strains of ransomware, which I'll get into in a second, but they mainly fall into two types. There's crypto ransomware and there's locker ransomware. And so on the crypto side, exactly what it sounds like, right? The ransomware encrypts valuable files on the computer so that they become unusable, essentially. And then they generate income by basically holding those files ransom and demanding that the victims pay in order to get those unencrypted. On the other hand, the locker type does not encrypt the files and instead just locks the user out of the device completely. And so then they're asking for ransom in order to just unlock that device and give you access. And so more of a denial of service. Well, both of them are denying service, but yeah, it's just locking you out of the device. Now, variants. There are an infinite amount of variants when it comes to ransomware at this point, and it just continues to grow over time. These are just a couple of different examples. I will call out a few just to show the different variations of how some of these variants work, and I think this is important to understand. I'm gonna, cover some of these because this context helps people understand why, one, you need a layered cybersecurity strategy, but two, sometimes why just, having, backups as an option without segmenting them and things like that is not enough. And so you'll get a flavor of the different types that are out there. Some of these are a little bit older, some are newer, but we'll have a good mix. So Bad Rabbit, for example, this is a strain of ransomware that has infected organizations in Russia and Eastern Europe. It spreads through a fake Adobe Flash update. So everybody should at this point be aware of the fact that Flash updates are a very popular way to distribute malware and things like that. But they have these fake updates right on compromised sites. And then when the ransomware infects the machine, the user gets directed to pay a certain amount of ransom in Bitcoin. Cerber is one that targets cloud-based Microsoft 365 users. This one has impacted millions of users through an elaborate phishing campaign. And this just emphasizes the growing need for SaaS backup in addition to on-prem, because they're really targeting a cloud-based solution in that case. CryptoLocker is one that's been around for, the last 2 decades. It's been around for quite a while. It really became popular in 2013. The original sort of botnet was shut down shortly after, but not before they had already gotten, I think, 3 million or so from victims. But since then, this method has just been widely copied, and we see a lot of different versions of it come out today. One example being CryptoWall, which was, I would say, like after the downfall of the first one, sort of just spun off into a lot of different variants of that. Another one, Crisis. So this is one that encrypts files on fixed, removable, and network drives with a very strong algorithm that makes it very difficult to sort of, crack or try to reverse. It is typically spread through email attachments with a double file extension, so that it looks like it's a non-executable file when it is. Another one, CTB Locker. So this one takes a different approach to distribution. It actually kind of takes a page out of like a Girl Scout cookies distribution, or like think Mary Kay Cosmetics, where these attackers are basically outsourcing the infection process to partners in exchange for a cut of the process. And so that way you're able to achieve large volumes of infections and things like that. I'll cover up a couple more here. Let's see, Jigsaw. So Jigsaw encrypts and then progressively deletes files until a ransom is paid. And so this one puts a little more pressure on folks who have fallen victim to this. So it deletes a single file after the first hour, deletes more and more per hour until it hits a 72-hour mark, at which point all of the remaining files are deleted. So it's like that ransom with like the added kind of progressive threat. Let's see, we'll do, maybe two or three more. So Ryuk is another one. I never know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I've heard it said so many times. It's the first one in the third column. This one has been wreaking havoc on innocent, victims for, especially of recent, starting, last year we started to see a lot of this. But it's reported that this variant was responsible, or this group is responsible for a third of all ransomware attacks that happened in the last year. So clearly gained a lot of popularity, but this was really used, especially in targeting, companies like hospitals in the height of the pandemic, which was very unfortunate to see, government, municipalities, and more. But they encrypt those business critical files that I mentioned, really going after the ones that will hurt, and then demanding high ransoms, typically in the millions of dollars, is what we see there. And then I can't go through this list and not call out WannaCry, because that was such a huge campaign that affected organizations across the globe. The ransom hit over 125,000 organizations across 150 countries. And it was a strain that affected Windows machines through an exploit known as Eternal Blue. So that was a huge one. And then last one, Zcryptor. This was a self-propagating malware strain that acts almost like a worm, in that it encrypts files, but then also looks for other machines that it can be distributed to, and so on. And so definitely having that spread or replication approach. And so I know this is a lot, but just wanted to give some insight into the different variants, and the fact that this is not all inclusive, of course. Like, there's much more, and this just shows that. So this is another look at activity from the first quarter of this year. And I think the big thing that sticks out here is, you see this huge line from the group Conti, which, while it's considered a ransomware as a service model, or RAS model variant, which I'll cover more and dig into a little bit, the way that it works is that they gain initial access to your network through either like spear phishing campaigns that have malicious attachments or links, stolen or weak remote desktop protocol connections, phone calls, fake software. Like, they have a very robust kind of approach to getting this into organizations. But I think also what is contributing to their like fast rise, or the high activity, is their business model as an organization, and how they compensate people who deploy their ransomware. And so hold that thought, because I'll come back to this topic in a second. But just wanted to share this at this point to show just the variation of the different groups and activities that are going on out there. Now, another quick question for you all is, from a SaaS solution perspective, what solution do you think is getting targeted the most by ransomware attackers right now? And again, feel free to pop your letters in the chat. Let's see, we have Microsoft, OneDrive, we have a lot of Microsoft OneDrive, some Dropbox, quite a bit of Dropbox. Okay, so it looks like we're faring almost half and half between OneDrive and Dropbox, some Google Suite in here. Okay, cool. So let's see what the answer is. Dropbox for the win. We had a lot of people say Dropbox, but the others, also on this list as well. So, bottom line here is there's one, the need to focus on SaaS solutions, which I think some people tend to forget or overlook. And a lot of these storage solutions are targeted because you have one, just it's storage, right? So it's where a lot of data is being kept, but then also there's the access at the individual and enterprise level. And so a lot of targets happening towards these very popular tools that I'm sure a lot of people on this call, I know I've used all of these at some point, right? And so very popular tools that these hackers are targeting. Now, another quick thing to touch on when it comes to trends, I found this really interesting as well. I know this image is probably blurry. Intent is not to read it, but just to kind of show what a real notice look like. But what I found interesting is some attackers are actually doing almost like A/B testing to see what works best for payment. And so in this case, for example, it's a very mild tone. Again, don't expect you to read it, but it's basically saying, hey, your business is at risk. You have some security gaps. We noticed this, and we noticed that we can encrypt your files. And so we did this to really help you. Thankfully, we aren't bad guys like some of the other attackers. We're just here to educate you. Now pay us a ransom, right? And so it's like a very nice way to skate around the fact that you're still hitting us with ransomware and asking for payment, and then we'll decrypt your data. So this averages up to 320K in payment with this note. Now, the quick question for you all, again, would love your thoughts on this. So that was a more nice message, right? And so do you believe that a firmer tone or a more stern tone would result in a higher payment or a lower one? Or do you think it doesn't make a difference at all? Okay, so I see a good mix here. So some on the higher side, no difference. We have some lower, so it's a mix in between. Let's see, a lot of no difference. Okay, yeah, thanks y'all for sharing the perspectives. It looks like we have a very solid mix. So interestingly enough, the answer is lower. So when people are short and more blunt, in this example, again, don't expect you to read it, but they're basically saying like, hey, we've attacked you and now you need to pay up. People are not as willing to pay. And so it's interesting just to think about the psychology that goes behind this, of attackers approaching this as like, hey, I'm trying to help you. People are willing to pay more than if somebody comes at them with a more stern note. So yeah, definitely a lot of psychology and like human. I'm really big on like the human element of cybersecurity, and I think this is such a good example of that. Now, getting into some of the key trends and evolutions as well. We'll talk about how ransomware has evolved. So there's a couple of different things I had started to touch on. So these attacks are getting more targeted. So there's the advanced persistent variants and things that are just way more intelligent and are looking for the most important or critical data, right? Looking for your backups and encrypting those so you don't have a way to recover, right? If attackers know that backups are a common solution. We've talked about basic digital extortion, right? It's basically locking up the system or revoking access and then paying to get that back. But another trend is this idea of double extortion, where they're blocking access to the technology, but then also saying, hey, like we have a copy of this and we're going to leak your data if you don't pay this money. And so that is another element of this that becomes of concern. Another one, and probably I think, from my opinion, all of these are concerning, but this is one of the like key drivers I think that's making ransomware an even bigger issue today, and that's RAS, or ransomware as a service. This is huge. So as you can imagine, like one of the biggest trends in technology over the last decade has been the growth of subscription-based service models and products. And so given the high demand for ransomware in this day and age, these creative cyber criminals are like, I sometimes call them like dark side entrepreneurs, essentially, but they're following this trend, right? And building these models where they are offering ransomware as a service to ease the burden of cyber attackers having to develop their own attacks. And so using these services, these cyber criminals are able to launch varying levels of attacks, from some of the novice ones to some that are pretty sophisticated. And then a RAS provider may keep a percentage of the profits of the attack as a service fee. So it's like, hey, if you use my attack software and you end up getting, $1 million in ransom, I'm keeping 5% of that as my fee. And so you can see how that can become a very lucrative business model for some of these people. Now back to the one variant I mentioned before that is that we saw a lot of activity from earlier this year. That is a RAS organization that I mentioned, and there's a variation in how they structure it. So I mentioned typically like people take a commission off of the ransom, but according to the CISA, their developers pay the deployers of the ransomware a wage rather than a percentage of the proceeds that is used by these attackers. And then versus them receiving a percentage of the ransom. And what I think that does is, because there's a more solid guarantee of income, right? You're not hoping that this attack is successful and then you might get a percentage, right? It's like you have a set wage and your job is just to deploy this. I think there's less risk involved, and so you see more people, especially in certain countries, like more interested in carrying out these attacks or helping push these attacks along. The other thing that I'll say is these are run as legitimate service businesses. So some of these services are so advanced that they include customer support, they have service level agreements, they have satisfaction guarantees and more. And so this is just a new realm of service that again, just offsets all of the burden of coding and crafting these attacks from the criminals. And so it really reduces the difficulty of launching these attacks, and what once required a lot of planning and preparation can now just be purchased as a subscription, like you would an email account or a video streaming service. Today I'm buying Netflix, tomorrow I'm buying some ransomware kit. And so yeah, that's the rise of ransomware as a service, and attackers love this method. And this stat is a representation of that, right? 64% of ransomware attacks were powered by a RAS solution versus people sort of creating their own attacks. Now, more evolutions to consider here. One is that dark web recruiting is increasing. And this is basically where attackers are targeting employees inside of organizations to help them launch their attacks or get ransomware into the organization. And so we see a lot of that happening. And I think it just ties into the fact that you don't only have to pay attention to, random people who are outside trying to get into your company, but also looking at folks inside and knowing that risk is there and managing that. Ransomware sizes, touched on this already, so I won't dig in too deep here, but the sizes are more intentional and calculated, right? So that percent of revenue versus arbitrary numbers and things like that are becoming more common. Another piece is on the decryption follow-through challenges. So there was this sort of prior reputation of people would pay the ransom and the data still wouldn't get decrypted, or they still wouldn't get access back. There's some trends in that still going on, but as these organizations aim to be more professional and aim to really be these like kind of shady enterprises or criminal enterprise organizations, they're trying to build trust and follow through with their customers. It's still wishy-washy. Again, no guarantee that your access is going to be restored, but I think they're starting to see trends in and shifts in that. And then the last piece is authorities really cracking down on consequences. So it might seem like these people have been kind of running wild over the last year, especially. There's really been a consolidated effort from international law enforcement agencies to crack down on these threat actors. And so while it's not an easy task at all to disrupt ransomware groups, because they're made up of different subgroups, like there's a lot of people are involved, it's just harder to track. But law enforcement agencies are really working to collaborate, especially across industries and across countries, to disrupt these. And so a couple of examples on this: earlier this year, law enforcement agencies in Bulgaria and the US successfully disrupted the infrastructure that is associated with NetWalker ransomware, for example. So they seized the server that was used for their data leak site and for what they used to host their dark web pages. And after that seizure, there was a significant drop in the activity from that operator. Same with countless others. There was another one where they tracked some of the transactions back to a couple of folks, arrested them, and that variant also saw a decrease in activity shortly after that. Now, of course, there's, I think the culprit behind Kaseya, or at least one of them, was also charged yesterday or the day before, very recent. And so I think the bottom line is that law enforcement is really starting to crack down on these. I think the random nature of some of these associations and memberships means that there's no guarantee that cracking down will completely abolish or stop these groups, right? They might just like lay low because they know there's attention on them, and then, you know, come back when things cool down. Only time will tell. We'll have to see. But I think that is one shift to keep in mind, that folks are trying to crack down on this, which is important. Another thing is that when dealing with RAS, or I think just ransomware in general, the level of professionalism is increasing. So like I mentioned, these are really high-end, almost like enterprises at this point. And so these groups are they've gone from being these random sort of low-level, you know, criminal organizations to enterprises with very advanced operations. Some of their professional, you know, services and methods include formally hosting these data leak sites where they provide updates on ransomware, they provide victim lists and so on. They launch social media advertising campaigns, like that can be included in certain packages or operations to publicize their attacks. They use call centers to further harass victims. They outsource some of their non-technical services. For example, they also have call centers for victim relations if you need assistance with getting your payments done or anything like that. And so, so yeah, just the level of professionalism there just continues to amaze me. One of the last things, or second to last things I want to touch on as we go on trends before we sort of shift gears here is there's a lot of things going on around supply chain, right? I talked about this in the beginning, but this has received a lot of well-warranted buzz as of late, because these disruptions are not just about money or loss of access at this point. Like, that's important to businesses, of course, but I think the stakes are just getting much higher and impacting livelihood and quality of life in some cases. So, for example, the FBI sent out a private industry notification to warn organizations that the food and agriculture sector is at potential risk, right? So the increased reliance on smart technologies, IoT devices, industrial control systems, all of that exposes the sector to a lot of different attacks that can lead to disruption in operations, specifically impacting the food supply chain. And so all types of businesses in this sector have to pay attention to that, right? From farms to processors to manufacturers to markets to restaurants, everything in between. And so this is just one industry example, but I think the bottom line is that from a supply chain standpoint, when you start looking at some of these critical infrastructure sectors like energy and food and transportation and things like that, the impact is, again, so much greater than just that money element. And so this becomes an even more important conversation because the stakes are getting higher. Now, last trend that I want to touch on before we get into a quick case study that ties all of this together are these interesting combination attacks that are happening. So it's one thing to deal with ransomware on its own. It's another thing to have that be paired with something else that just makes it even worse. And I think that's something that these attackers are doing, because at the end of the day, like they want to do whatever will give them the greatest chances of getting their ransom paid. And so one example is the combination of ransomware and denial of service attacks, or distributed denial of service, DDoS. So again, like it almost seems like these can't get any worse, but be careful what you wish for, right? So these operators will launch their ransomware attack, and then at the same time incorporate this denial of service. This was first observed in October of last year when SunCrypt conducted these kinds of attacks against their targets. And other different groups started to use that same method as well, again, because it increases the pressure on the victim, especially those who don't intend to pay, right? As they attempt to restore their systems, they're now really being taken down again through another angle, which is tough. Another one, ransomware meets sort of account compromise. So in this case, this is a prime example of the importance of managing access. So basically earlier this year, a ransomware group took the credentials of an employee who had actually passed away 3 months prior to the attack, and compromised their credentials. And because that account was still active within the organization's systems, they were able to use that access to deploy ransomware within the organization. And so again, just a reminder of the fact that as one, like we have to pay attention to active accounts, right? And making sure that those accounts should be active, monitoring privileged access of users and so on, and making sure that you have an account provisioning and deprovisioning process that reduces some of this risk. And then the last one, I found this one really interesting, is that Ziggy, I call it meets ransomware meets conscience. And what they did essentially is earlier, they basically shut down their operation and offered refunds, which sounds crazy, but yeah, they offered refunds to their victims. And so they released 900 or so decryption keys. And this sort of, bizarre story, but basically they said that they wished to turn towards ransomware hunting instead of actually conducting the operations themselves and actually attacking people. I would suspect that part of this comes from that increased pressure of law enforcement, right? Like they're really cracking down on this. I mean, it could be several different reasons, but I think the one that comes to mind is, as these consequences surface and as people, get in trouble for this stuff, maybe it's that second thought of like, which side should I be on here? But the other thing that's reported is that given the original ransom value and how Bitcoin, because that's what they were paid in, right? And how Bitcoin has risen in value, they're still going to get a profit even if they were to return the actual cash. So interesting stuff there. Now, the last piece on fundamentals that I want to touch on before we get into the fireside chat with Rolando here in a little bit, and the second half of the discussion on what exactly can be done to defend against these attacks and all of the trends that I'm talking about, is to walk through a few key cases and some of the lessons learned from these. So I think one that, was a big topic of discussion this year was the Colonial Pipeline attack. And so I'll spend a minute on that and then spend more on the next one. But Colonial Pipeline is the largest pipeline system for refined oil products in the US, based out in Georgia. They were hit with ransomware in May of 2021. This prompted the company to shut down basically one of America's major arteries for fuel delivery, right? And so they and the FBI reported that this was organized by a criminal group operating out of Europe. And while it was contained to, the attack was contained to the company's billing systems, according to like early reports. To further prevent consequences, they proactively shut down their operations to make sure that it didn't spread to other systems in the network and so on. Now, this company distributes 45% of the fuel consumed on the East Coast. And so what this led to was panic buying from people. I'm sure like this isn't news to most people on this call. You probably heard of and saw the aftermath of this, right? But it led to panic buying, people now, trying to get as much fuel as they can, people putting fuel in plastic bags and milk cartons, all kinds of things out of fear, which led to a fuel shortage, which led to price hikes, which affected millions of people in these areas. And so This is, again, just another example of how these attacks are not just impacting some company and their bottom line from a dollar standpoint. This is now impacting people and quality of life and so on. And so both the US government and the FBI intervened to just manage the impact of those consequences. Now, attacks at this scale serve as a really big wake-up call, right? Even from the dollar amount that was paid out, it's been reported that they paid out 5 million in Bitcoin to restore and gain access to their network infrastructure and that data. The DOJ reported that they were able to get some of that back through a seizure warrant. And a lot has happened since. But again, this is a prime example of the just impact and magnitude of some of these attacks, and a real example from recent times. Now, for the sake of time, I won't spend too much more time on this one. I'll leave it here, but I think the key takeaway is this is expensive. It spans beyond just losing money. And so definitely something to keep in mind. The more recent one and last example that I'll touch on real quick is Kaseya. Now, digging into this more, so just a quick background on this, though, again, I'm sure you all heard of this. Just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So over the summer, an Ireland-based IT solutions firm was hit by a ransomware attack with a price tag of $70 million. Their clientele included, enterprises of all sizes as well as MSPs. Now, this incident was essentially described as a supply chain ransomware attack because it exploited a vulnerability in Kaseya's software and used that to target or impact multiple MSPs and their customers. And so it was estimated that this impacted anywhere from 800 to 1,500 small and medium-sized businesses. But the attackers themselves are claiming to have impacted millions of devices. And then the other kind of piece and aftermath for that is the possibility of, how far can this go? Like, how can we control this? Like, all of these questions really started to pop up around these supply chain attacks more and more. And now, how did this happen? Well, attackers exploited an authentication sort of bypass vulnerability in the Kaseya web interface that triggered this breach, which eventually impacted those MSPs. And that vulnerability really allowed the attackers to circumvent authentication controls, gain an authenticated session, upload malicious malware, and then the rest is history. And the reason why they were able to do that is because they targeted the server that is used to deploy software and automate IT tasks and more. So that server was highly trusted on the customer network. And so I think the bottom line or the key takeaway there is one, quick response. So a couple of days after the attack, they published 2 help books and guides to help folks who were impacted, and then shortly after released a patch and supported customers in deploying it. So according to them, 100% of their SaaS customers were live with this fix within a 10-day window. And so I think there's a couple of different lessons learned that I want to touch on again as we wrap this up and move in fireside chat. And I think those are one, these are huge eye openers in the sense that no matter what size your company is today, every organization has internal risks, and also, if you rely on third-party solutions, that can add risk. And so in follow-up, right, the conversation across the industry is one, we have to mitigate risks, or I would say 2, we have to mitigate risks from 2 angles, right? It's like, I think I have to protect myself from my own cyber threats, right? That's the one piece. But I have to protect myself from cyber threats of my third or fourth parties. But then I also have to protect my customers from all of this as well. Or as a third party, I have to be able to protect people from risk. And so it's these different elements or things to keep in mind. And also making sure that you're working with third parties and folks who that you can trust and who are holding their weight from a cybersecurity standpoint to make sure that you're not exposing yourself to more risk. So I know that is a lot of information. But hopefully that gives some insight into the current landscape and some of the threats that we are seeing happen. Now, we are going to transition into the fireside chat. Before we do that, Rolando, if you can just come on, but I see a question come up, so I'll just address this real quick and then we'll keep going. So, is it safe to go with a RMM software that has been breached previously or one that has not been? Yeah, so the one question that came through is it safe to go with an RMM software that has been breached previously or one that has not been? I think this is a very, and thanks for sharing the question. I think it's really, and it depends, because part of my opinion on one end is it's every company is at risk of getting attacked. I think it's how prepared you are and how you respond, and the controls that you continue to put in place and evolve that really matter. So I would be asking the questions like, is the company doing things to make sure that doesn't happen again? Like, what's the security posture like, whether somebody has been breached or not breached in the past, right? I think ultimately, like, that's the fundamental question. What is being done to prevent these risks? What's the cybersecurity posture or stance of the company? I would start there, because at the end of the day, a company who has never been breached might not know they've been breached, right? Or they could be breached tomorrow, right? Same with the company who has been breached in the past. And so I would be looking more at, like, objectively, whether you've been breached or not, what is your security posture today? And is that enough? Now, okay, so getting into the fireside chat, and I see that we have Rolando on. So I am going to stop sharing this real quick, and let's see if I can just quickly bring you to the spotlight. Can I bring myself to the spotlight as well? Yep. Okay, cool. So we have us both here. Awesome. Hi, welcome.
Hi. Thanks for listening. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, so excited to segue into this fireside chat with Rolando to sort of talk with an experienced cybersecurity leader who has dealt with response and things like this head on. And so happy to jump into this. Just a quick background on Rolando, though I'll give him a chance to introduce himself. I'm sure he'll do a much better job than I will, but just as context, like, I had the pleasure of working with Rolando for a few years in the past. And I gotta say, like, he is the real deal when it comes to incident response in general, and much more. So Rolando is very experienced, has a ton of knowledge on offensive security, incident response planning and execution, security strategy, training and awareness, and more within large corporations. He is also a certified cloud security professional and holds an additional global information assurance certification. So perfect person to hear from on this critical topic. Again, welcome, Rolando, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for the flattering introduction as well. I think you did a great job of introducing me, so I'm flattered. And I can expand on it. So hi, everyone. Rolando Lopez. As part of, just expand a bit on Christine was saying, she covered it very well. But I've had experience and the pleasure of working with security operations centers and building and maturing SOCs for Fortune 100 companies, that ranging from some of the major airlines for the US, as well as some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the US, and some of the largest data science companies for the US as well, and as well as consulting for various companies on their incident response engagements, from all things security operations, from incident response down to continuous monitoring strategy, to their security architecture and controls, all the way through just tabletop planning and exercises, just to make sure that they are prepared should they run into a major incident. So very excited to be here today and to share some battle stories with you.
Yeah, we're looking forward to hearing them. And I love that we've touched on the fact that like critical infrastructure is such an important angle here because there's so much more at stake than just losing access and dollars. And so it sounds like you've built these programs across that entire spectrum to a certain extent. So again, great expertise to have here. Now, first question that I want to ask is like, what concerns you or keeps you up at night the most when you think about some of these ransomware trends happening today, some of the things that I've touched on, or anything else that you're hearing across the industry and seeing?
Yeah, so oh man, what doesn't? There's so much on the news lately. It's hard to single out one, but if at a higher level, I would say what keeps me up at night is the evolution of ransomware and extortion-based threats, and just the courageousness of the threat actors to go after more high-profile targets, like you mentioned earlier, the Colonial Pipeline attack is such a huge target, and it was still attacked and still had a ransom held, and they even bragged about it in underground forums. So I think just the evolution of ransomware into some of those more high-profile threats, and also just the techniques that are being leveraged, are moving away from your traditional encryption channels to extort victims, and moving also into very similar tactics that are used by advanced threats around living off of the land, which for those that aren't familiar is essentially using the tools that your security team deploys and your IT teams deploy in your environment against them. So these are things like Microsoft BitLocker that is used by companies to rightfully so encrypt and protect their data, have also been now seen used by threat actors to encrypt for malicious purposes and extort victims. 7-Zip, which is a common IT tool that's used by cybersecurity professionals to compress files for or for sharing, have also been used in major profile incidents to encrypt the data and password protect it in order to extort victims. So that trend of moving to living off the land makes it more challenging for the security professionals, and continues that cat and mouse game of chasing those threats, and how do you respond to those. As well, on top of that, just as part of the evolution, there's been a trend. Christine, I love that you mentioned the double extortion trend. There's been added functionality to a lot of ransomware in cases where it doesn't discriminate against who you are, small, big, large company. It doesn't matter. They will equally and across the board pull the data that they encrypt off of your network and use that data to extort you. So I think that double extortion is also a scary one, because it starts to move the ball away from historically the impression of assume you're going to get breached to now assume you're going to get breached and assume your data is already gone when that happens, right? And it really changes some of the fundamental ways that we have to consider data storage and protecting that information, not just for our company, but for the customers as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the idea of just assuming your data is already gone is it's unfortunately a scary mindset to have to embrace, but it's the reality that we live in, and we have to prepare for that, right? So I want to mention before I just ask this next question, of course, feel free to continue to add questions in the chat if there are things that you want to know as well. But I think one of the biggest things that we all want to hear, right, is walk us through a ransomware attack that you've been through. I know you've seen a ton of different incidents, and I know you've faced and responded to any of these, so don't have to name any names, of course, or anything like that. But just walk us through a ransomware attack that you've been through. How did it start? What happened? How did it end?
Yeah. So full disclaimer, this incident that I'm going to share is not tied to a specific company that I've helped lead the security operations center for. I've had an opportunity to help many companies on just responding to cyber threats and consulting for them. So not tied to any company that I've been associated with specifically, but I just wanted to share that disclaimer. But yeah, no, I've had the opportunity of responding to many cyber incidents, including ransomware cases and other extortion-based cases. With some of the brightest minds of cybersecurity. So one of them specifically that I think will always hold a special place in my heart was actually related to a case that started off very small, and I'm sure many security practitioners this will resonate with, where we received the company had received an initial detection on what appeared to be potentially low risk activity. It was a device that was reaching out on suspicious ports to other devices in the environment. It wasn't external coming in, it was internal going to other internal. So the first thought is it might be an IT team that's performing authorized activity. So they started chasing it down, talked it through with the admin, and then the admin admitted that he was doing some testing and wasn't sure what was going on in that device, but was likely related to the testing. So the security team dismissed the alert, only to find the scanning activity continued, and down the road, a larger alert fired where multiple devices were facing similar activity, which then raised a few more flags on, okay, maybe this is worse than was anticipated. So at that point, the company brought in the incident response, started the incident response engagement, and digging in, they realized that luckily, in this case, the company had built a very strong perimeter. I think as many companies do, build very strong externally on the DMZ and all of your assets, make sure that's all patched up and not vulnerable. But they had a squishy center, and there were devices on their network that were unmanaged and weren't regularly patched. So what was observed is that the malware then it was actually a worm that spread ransomware, and it started from an unmanaged host and scanned and found other unmanaged hosts and continued to move laterally in an automated fashion that was scripted through unmanaged devices on the environment. When I say unmanaged, these are devices that are no longer have the security stack, may have been orphaned through various migrations or IT projects, and may have also just been decommissioned and may have been missed during that decommission and not thoroughly removed from the environment. So the malware was propagating through those devices, and the security team essentially started their game of whack-a-mole, knocking each of them down offline, and then ultimately taking a larger stance and looking at the network and putting containment measures in place at the network. This can be done at your switch layer, at the firewall layer if it's external in, or even if you have host-based firewalls as well. So all of those options were explored and implemented to make sure that they could get their hands around the threat and stop it from spreading further. And then ultimately, once that was contained and the threat of spreading was addressed, then digging in and understanding what was the initial access point, who was patient zero, how did it start, so that they can ultimately get down to answer the question of when did this start and when can we safely revert back to backups without potentially compromising our environment further by implementing backups that may have been compromised. So at that point, the analysis began. They were able to identify patient zero, and turns out that patient zero actually was not even one of their assets. It was a trusted vendor that had came in to do routine maintenance work, plugged in a laptop that was maintained by the vendor and patched by the vendor, and that laptop then began to propagate the malware as soon as it connected to the network. And it just took one host that was not patched against that the vulnerability that malware was scanning for, and voila, the infection began and the outbreak began. So once they identified that, needless to say, conversations happened in parallel with their vendor for repercussions. But also they then had a date on when they could safely restore from backup, and the recovery of the business began at that point on recovering and getting those devices back to a clean state. And what they found actually as they were doing that is that some of the devices, many of them that had gotten infected were legacy devices that were no longer managed, no longer used. So they were able to almost overnight clean up their attack surface greatly internally by just blowing away all of these devices that are no longer managed. People may have left the company that had development environments or environments that were no longer leveraged and had been migrated away from. So overnight, they cleaned up their footprint drastically and were able to recover appropriately, and then move into just some planning and next steps to do some lessons learned so that they never had to run into a similar situation in the future. I'm glad to say that they then moved into network access controls that would prevent another vendor from coming in and doing the same. But that growth is also an important piece to highlight as part of that incident, just growing from it, and to your point, making sure that your controls and measures that you have in place are adequate, so that you don't have to run into a similar incident again based on the company's risk posture.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the deep dive on that. Like, it's so interesting to hear the from the start and the kind of discovery to, you know, really doing the like root cause analysis to understand like where did this start to get to that backup point. So so yeah, interesting story there. Now you touched on everything from like unmanaged devices to like the third party element and this being some kind of like laptop that wasn't what you expected it to be, to, you know, the exploitation of, it sounds like, access for people who might not have been there, or cleaning all of that up. All that said, like, what would you say are like key lessons that were learned from this incident, especially from like a response standpoint? Like,
Yeah.
what did you think well versus like what could have been better?
Yeah, so I think at its core, it's security leaders should make sure that their security team has the visibility that they need to track a threat from the initial access through lateral movement, through the actions and objectives, all the way up until the security team catches them. And having the evidence and forensic artifacts along the way to paint that story helps guide your teams on where to dig next and where to find hosts. Without those logs, it's a game of whack-a-mole, and you're not sure if you've truly contained the threat. So one I'd say is making sure that you have the right visibility and controls in place to give you your teams that visibility. And then getting back to the basics, just making sure that you have your security stack rolled out on all devices, and that for those devices that don't have it, you have additional controls to prevent something like this from spreading to them. Making sure that you have that backup, and yet you have your routine backups and rigor around BCDR, so the backups aren't just stored and then you go to restore from backup only to find out that the backup's corrupt. You hear that telltale story repeatedly. Make sure that you're testing your backups and that they work, and that your team has a plan on how to roll back, and that plan can be executed at any hour of the day, any day of the week, because incidents don't wait for business hours to take effect. Additionally, on top of that, making sure that from a security leader perspective, there's going to be a lot of pressure to get the business back up. The business wants to make money at the end of the day, and understandably so, they want to recover. But as a security leader, making sure that you are the voice of reason for your team and emphasizing that they understand the initial access point and that data is the priority. That data point is the priority to make sure that when you tell the business that you're recovered, that you can confidently say that we were recovering to a point when the environment was clean. You hear telltale horror stories all the time of someone recovering or blowing away and using a virtual machine image and cloning that to restore their environment, only to find out that the original virtual machine was compromised. And now they've just infected their environment even further. So I'd say really understanding that root cause will make sure that you don't shoot yourself in the foot, so to speak, and make the situation worse. So really being that voice of reason as a cybersecurity leader and making sure that your team has that data point and understands the importance of it before telling the business that it's okay to recover. The business should have BCDR plans in place. If they don't, they will quickly develop those. But yeah, those are I'd say the key learnings that I would say from the incident, as well as network access control, making sure that you have controls to prevent somebody from just plugging into your network. There's ways to limit it. You can have virtual machines that vendors access your environment from that are controlled and can only access the specific devices that they need. And that will greatly help reduce the potential attack from a rogue device being plugged into your network, or even an authorized device being plugged into your network and causing an outbreak.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm hearing is there's a lot of different layers to this is one piece. And then two, I think from every incident and every experience that you have, there's a ton of lessons to be learned, and you have to like adapt. You have to adapt to that very quickly. So, so yeah, thank you for that. I have one more question for you, and then we'll let you go. But before I do, if anybody has any questions, also, again, remember to put those in the chat, and I'm happy to squeeze any of those in if we have the time. So last question is, for folks who are looking to build stronger ransomware defense programs in general, you already touched on some of these, I think, in the lessons learned, but in summarizing, like, what tips would you give folks who are looking to build those stronger programs?
Yeah, so I'd say don't underestimate the power of having a strong foundation and the basics. And when I say the basics, having BCDR plans in place, practicing those, making sure that you have backups that you can restore to, and that those backups are taken at intervals that your business can actually use, and you won't lose business data. So really getting down to the basics there around BCDR, cybersecurity hygiene, making sure that you have, to your point, Christine, I love that you mentioned the human element to it. You can have all of these controls in place, and it just takes one person to be social engineered, and that's the foothold into your environment. So making sure that you have those foundational elements of a security awareness program in place, and teaching your employees as well, and then having the security controls in place to supplement that. I touched on visibility, making sure that from the aspect of assuming that you will get compromised at some point, make sure that your security team is prepared for that compromise, have incident response plans in place, test those incident response plans to pressure test them, make sure that your SOC has the visibility that they need to investigate and the tools that they need to investigate, so that when it happens, you can respond appropriately. And then lastly, as far as the trends, I would say move past the assume you've been breached and start to absorb the mindset to assume that your data will be compromised at some point and exfiltrated, because like Christine mentioned, double extortion is a big trend. And in that sense, take a deeper look into your data itself. And if your data is exfiltrated, start to implement techniques to protect that data, like encryption, like randomizing the data, so that it's not tied to a specific subject that would warrant regulatory notification obligations if the data were exfiltrated. Start to ask yourself and the business questions of do we really need to capture certain data points? Do we need a birth date? Or does maybe an age field warrant get them what's needed? Or do you need a name and address, or is a specific ID or identifier good enough to paint the data that you need? So really starting to drill into the data and starting to reduce your attack surface from the data standpoint as well. And then last but not least, I always recommend this one, no matter if it's ransomware or what the threat, multi-factor authentication on all external access points. I cannot stress enough how important this is. Microsoft reports that 99.9% of account compromises, like, and repeat that, 99.9%, which is virtually most of those account compromises, were initiated by automated scans that could have been prevented with MFA alone. So this is the single most important control that I can stress. Of course, there's tons of other ones in your program, but just making sure that you have this in today's environment with SaaS and cloud is key to make sure that you don't fall victim to ransomware, and that you're someone who gains access to a compromised account doesn't broker that access to one of the ransomware services Christine discussed earlier, and those services don't then get used to deploy ransomware into your environment.
Yeah, awesome. I love it. Yeah, I love especially the points around the deep questioning around data. I think that's something that we also often overlook and don't think about enough, because on one end, it's like, let's collect all of the data that we can, because all of the insight and analytics and all of the things that you can do with that. But it's like really questioning, at least from a security standpoint, like how can you make sure that you're still taking the minimum that you need so that you're reducing the scope of what you need to protect, right? And ultimately reducing your risk. So I love that you brought that point up. Love the point on two-factor. And so yeah, just a lot of really good points all around. Thank you for sharing that. Any final thoughts or words you want to share as we wrap up?
No. Keep security is always evolving. So if you don't have some of these measures in place, don't worry, you're not alone. It's always a great point to start and start with what you have available to you. every step of the way improves your security program. So good luck fighting the good fight. And Christine, I appreciate you having me on and giving me a chance to share some of the insights.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining again. This has been great. So I'm going to take you off the spotlight here, and we are going to get back into now looking at what we can do to address some of these threats, which Rolando has already kind of touched on. So give me a moment to get back to sharing my screen here. All right, awesome. And just as a quick reminder for folks, we are giving away a Sonos Play 5 at the end of this, so stick around. We'll see who the lucky winner is for that. Now, getting into the defense toolkit. So again, we've talked about some pretty concerning trends. Again, shout out to Rolando for all of the great insight. And he's already given us a very nice preview into some of the things that we can do to defend against these. But yeah, the great thing is that a lot of these attacks and trends can be avoided and addressed with the right preparation. And so it really requires a strategy that focuses on prevention, detection, and response. You have to cover those areas in order to really prepare for this. Now, getting into the prevention side first. So there's a couple of key things to keep in mind here. First is on the third-party risk management side. So of course, like for your third parties, know who they are, understand their security risk posture. The question had come up earlier around, considering, I think like security incidents or things from past companies. And again, I think the point is to understand what the company's security posture is today, especially when you're working with third parties, and what gaps exist and what the plans are for closing those gaps and so on. I think when you have that level of insight and understanding, it's up to you to sort of evaluate whether the risk is acceptable or the risk is low enough to move forward. From a technical standpoint, of course, ransomware attacks can be prevented by having a robust security technology stack that includes everything from adequate email security, network security, device security controls. So think that robust endpoint security piece. For example, since email as well is a primary delivery vector for ransomware, right? Blocking those kinds of emails before they even make it to the user's inbox can help prevent a lot of this stuff as well. Having up-to-date devices and software to make sure that exploitation of known vulnerabilities is avoided, which is something we touched on in the prior conversation. Multi-factor, of course. Another thing that's been of much discussion today is around building a culture of zero trust. So the notion of never trust, always verify. This isn't one solution or one thing that you can kind of turn a key on. It's a culture really, and a multi-pronged approach to just building a culture that really you focus on making sure that people are indeed who they say they are and are authorized to do the things that they are doing. Another piece is that most ransomware attacks require some sort of, or attacks in general require some sort of human action to execute, whether that's through an email message or an infected pop-up window that somebody clicks on, or somebody actually saying or giving out information that they shouldn't. There's implications to that user element. And so like a lot of preventative strategies, one of the best ways to reduce human error is by making users aware of the things that they should and shouldn't be doing. It's really important to educate employees on what ransomware is, how it works, help them understand how they might be targeted and what they can do to protect themselves and the company, as well as having technology in place to detect and manage threats that include those that are coming from folks outside of the organization, as well as people inside the organization. And then of course, strong access control, especially for privileged users, and making sure that you're able to block any access that is, block any activity that's malicious, make sure that you're managing access of users. I had touched on earlier, having strong provisioning and deprovisioning processes, all of that, those are all layers and things that can help from a preventative side. And then getting into detection, the detection piece is absolutely critical in all cyber incidents, right? Oftentimes people don't know that they've been breached until they discover that their customer data is on sale on the dark web or something. Ransomware is of course a little bit different in some cases because you get a note or some kind of alert. But like the stories that we heard earlier from Rolando, you can start to see some suspicious activity brewing in the beginning before you're even hit with that note or before you even realize what's going on. And so being able to have ways to detect that kind of thing, to have the visibility, to be able to screen for files that might have known ransomware variants, those are ways that you can start to more proactively detect some of these attacks. The other thing that I'll mention is from a people standpoint, again, really big on the human element of cybersecurity. I think people can also help you as well. So if you, while technology, of course, should be your first line of defense, having a method for employees who notices something's going on, right, to report these types of attacks can help where technology might be lacking or where there might be an oversight. Because depending on the type of attack, like if your systems haven't detected it, for example, and you just have an employee who, is hit with a ransomware note or realizes that something, bad is going on from a mistake that they made, they might feel embarrassed, they might be ashamed, they might be afraid to share, who knows? And so, especially if it's not just like ransomware, but it's like blackmail or some of the double extortion hits that we've been seeing. And so they may choose to take matters into their own hand, which you clearly don't want. And so having a clear direction and clear awareness of what employees should do in response to these kinds of attacks is really important. There should be a way for them to report incidents and things like that to a technical resource or to a cybersecurity team without necessarily being ridiculed or punished for this, sort of common human error. Because these attacks at the same time, they're getting very advanced and sophisticated. And sometimes it's hard for the average employee to understand what they should and shouldn't click on. And so while it's important to educate them, it's also important, in my opinion, to be a little bit understanding and try to encourage them to come forth with this kind of thing versus being scared that something bad will happen to them as a result. And then I think when it comes to, how to prepare for response, which is the next piece that I'll get into, one of the questions that tends to come up a lot is, should we pay for the ransom? Should we not? And questions like that. So I want to ask this last question here for you all to kind of chime in on. Do you believe that ransomware payment should be a part of the defense strategy? And feel free to, again, in the chat, just put your opinions in. Let's see, we have a solid no, unsure, absolutely B. I love the extra absolutely. B with rare exceptions, a couple of yeses. So yeah, it looks like there's a mix across the board. Of course, we have a couple of absolutely nots. We have not with rare exception. I think this variation is good, and there really isn't a right answer. These are good opinions. What I will say is when it comes to response, and thank you all for adding your opinions here. Oh, we have one comment as a fallback. Yes, I agree. Depends on who did the ransom. You can't negotiate with people who are considered terrorists. Good point. Yeah, so I think all in all, again, thanks for the opinions. When it comes to response, whether the requested ransom should be paid or not just remains a constant debate. I think one report said that 45% of companies who suffer a ransomware attack end up paying the attackers to regain access to their data. So that's almost 50% of people end up paying up. Unfortunately, only a quarter of those folks actually get what they paid for and get their money back. So the reality is, and I talked about some of these trends improving because these organizations want to be seen as more professional, but majority of cyber criminals still don't follow through after receiving payment. And then when you think about that double extortion piece and the fact that they've already exfiltrated your data anyway, if you pay the ransom and get access back, your data is still out there. And so in any case, there's a lot of different variables to consider, right? The criticality of the assets being impacted, the scope of the attack, the ransom amount. On top of this, what kind of attack is it? Is it a the encryption? Is it a lockout? Is it, blackmail? Is it a combination? All of these questions that I think run through people's minds as they think about what they need to do next. I think it ultimately depends on how prepared you are. Like, that's what it boils down to. I think it's an absolute last resort that people still keep in mind, but realize that if you're really prepared with the right proactive and reactive solutions, you likely won't need to pay ransom. And so that's kind of my thought on it. Again, there isn't a right or a wrong answer. And so I think the variation in responses, especially on that last question, makes a ton of sense. But I think that preparation is really what the key is. And so the first piece from a response standpoint and what will enable that is backups. Like, I know we've mentioned that quite a bit, but that's rule number one. There are some caveats, of course, that I'll get into in a minute, specifically on backups, but I think this is the first rule of thumb and what you need to wrap your mind around, because no matter what scenario is present, like if you have that backup and you're able to protect those and trust them and restore from them, then that helps. Same on the incident response side. Like, it doesn't matter what kind of attack you're dealing with, whether it's ransomware or anything else, having an incident response process is critical to surviving all of that. That disaster recovery, that business continuity, all of that is just absolutely critical and can save the company tons of money and time, as well as drastically reduce damages. Of course, those plans should be tested periodically with realistic scenarios like ransomware, just to ensure that you're really ready in case you do end up having facing this kind of attack. Because the last place you want to learn that your process is screwed up or your backup strategy isn't the best is you don't want to learn that in the middle of an incident. You want to learn that beforehand. And so that's really important there. But generally speaking, I've covered prevention, detection, and response. I think the ultimate takeaway is that there has to be a layered approach here, right? And there's not one single solution that will, defend against all things ransomware. But you can bring all of these things together to create as robust a strategy as you can to really defend against that. Now, the last piece that I'm going to dig into before we get into an overview of what this can look like in practice is your defense insurance, which is backups. So you need all of these different layers, right? They're very important. But at the end of the day, what comes out on the other end and what your essentially insurance is from a defense standpoint is having a solid backup strategy. And I want to touch on real quick here because I think this is important when you think about the kind of backup strategy that you build and why this is important, is that you can't just, back data up and walk away. You have to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of those backups, right? So you want to make sure that your backups can't be stolen or leaked or accessed by the wrong people, right? So you're maintaining that confidentiality. You want to make sure that these backups can't be altered or damaged in any way, that the integrity has been messed up. And you want to make sure, of course, that they can't be made unavailable, or that they can't be, attacked or encrypted with ransomware as well, to a point where you can't use them as well. Then there's essentially, no point to what you've done because it's unusable. And so the backup strategy is important to have one, but making sure that you're protecting it in a way that it covers all of these pieces. And so a few tips for establishing that backup strategy. First, using a 3-2-1 strategy. So the more backup copies that you have on different storage mediums, the less chances that, within reason, the less chances there are that they can be damaged by the same ransomware you're trying to recover from. And so a popular strategy is to basically have 3 copies of a single, file or a single system, right? You have the original file, you have the backup that's on a local storage medium, and then you have another backup that's offsite. That way, if the original data gets compromised, you can recover from the local storage because that's faster, right? It's already there. But if that is also impacted, or that is also encrypted by ransomware, whatever the case may be, you also have this offsite storage that might take a little bit longer to restore from, but at least you have that there. And this is where air gapping becomes important as well. So air gapping basically is making sure that you have backup storage that is physically disconnected from your local storage or your on-prem storage. And It's not connected to, cloud infrastructure, local network, anything like that. So it's essentially like it's like a separate, hard drive or server that you only plug into when you need to perform that backup. That's the key. And so that could be another sort of component to the strategy of just having that sort of offsite and one that like can't be accessed unless you actually need it, just to protect that even more. Again, the thing to keep in mind is that the recovery time and your objectives there, that method can take a little bit longer depending on how you have it set up, but it's definitely a good backup to the backups, to say the least. Ultimately, in any case, the bottom line there is that you want to have a trustworthy backup that you can restore from if you are impacted. The other piece is to limit access to backup storage and your backup application. Like seriously, like this is really important. So almost no one should have access to backup, especially not end users. Also keep in mind that we're not just talking about the actual like backed up data. We're talking about the applications that you use to manage those backups and those services as well. So if you have a centrally managed solution where you're able to sort of configure and set up your backups, the access to that system needs to be super tight and needs to be like very limited to very strict sort of need to know basis, like all systems. But this is really important as a part of this, because it's like if you have all this robust backup strategy and you have open access or weak access on the management of that, it's very easy for somebody to go in and mess up your backups or remove that as an option for you. And so yeah, that's important. The other piece is around coverage. So of course, you have to cover all of your important data, right? I use the term important because that's relative to a company. Like it's up to the company to determine what's important to back up and for how long and all of that. But the other point here is to think about holistically, like if you have data on-prem and you have data in the cloud, like making sure that you have coverage in all of those spaces. Also, if you have critical vendors or third parties that you rely on who are hosting data for you and things like that, making sure that they're doing backups on the data that they're hosting for you. Those are things to consider in the strategy as well. And the last piece is around retention, of course. So retention settings, right, are like rules and policies and things that you put in place around, how many copies of data should we be storing, how long should we store these for? There are some sort of, I would say, regulatory requirements around retention, but then there's also just like internal company policy. And so it's important to just set what those are and really follow them to meet your recovery objectives. Okay, so that is it on backups. Now, I know I have shared a lot here. Hopefully this helps give you a view on the issues and trends at hand, as well as starting to get some tips around what you can do about this. Now, the last piece that we're going to cover in this session is now an MSP 360 overview. And so for that, I will bring Seth to the virtual stage here. While I'm doing that, again, last reminder, we will be announcing the Sonos Prize winner at the end. And so be sure to stick around for that. And Seth, I'm gonna pin you, just give me 1 second here.
Take your time.
Awesome. Okay, I think we are good to go. So Seth is an MSP 360 product specialist with tons of insight on backup strategy for ransomware defense and more. And so be sure to keep dropping your questions or anything that you have that come up, either on things we've covered in the session before or during this overview. We'll make sure to get to those questions as well. And so yeah, Seth, take it away.
All right, perfect. Thanks a lot, Christine. Hey guys, how's it going? This is Seth Hartness again. I'm over here at MSP 360 Product Specialist. I know this has kind of been a long seminar for you guys, so hopefully keep it short and sweet for you and just touch on a couple of things that we're doing over here to help mitigate ransomware spread. Christine, do I have presenter privileges by chance?
You do not. I'm happy to, I can either click through for you or
that's perfect. That's perfect.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. No worries, no worries. Yeah, so we designed MSP 360 Managed Backup Service and really the overall platform with three things in mind: to be profitable, affordable, and powerful. So at the end of the day, we allow you to take those same cost savings that we give to you and then pass them on to your clients at the end of the day. So some of the main things that we've set up with the managed backup service and the RMM solution as well, such things such as immutable storage. To Christine's point previously, you obviously want to make sure that you have backups, but what are the backups if they've been tampered with? So utilizing some level of immutable storage on the back end to ensure the fact that those backups can't be tampered with or deleted or anything of the like, definitely set up some level of high level ransomware response. Obviously, we implement the 3-2-1 backup rule as well. MSP 360 as a whole, we're completely storage agnostic. So at the end of the day, we don't dictate where you put the data, whether it be locally, the cloud, a mixture of the two. We'd prefer a mixture of the two, but obviously we understand that some clients may not have that internet bandwidth to get backups off site. So we're trying to work with those as best we can. So we allow you to utilize the public storage landscape: AWS, Azure, GCP, Wasabi, Backblaze. So those are the main five. Obviously, there are some other ones thrown in there as well. In terms of the frequency of your backups, obviously just ensuring the fact that you have overall consistent RPOs throughout the day. We don't dictate any of the scheduling parameters that you set with any of your backup jobs. Most of that stuff is going to be pretty network dependent, just overall what you're able to utilize with that bandwidth. In terms of the last level, so obviously we're no longer in the reactive, or rather the proactive phase. We're in the reactive phase. If you've been hit with ransomware, we do have restore verification with all of our backups, all image-based backups, I should say, where we're just downloading the system needed pieces to basically get you to the boot screen. Ultimately, at that point, we're going to email you just a picture essentially of the boot screen, just showing you that in fact that backup is healthy, and should you get hit with ransomware, you have consistent recovery points that you can rely on. In terms of our RMM solution, this is relatively new to the space, and that's kind of where, we're the MSP 360 platform now, but we're doing some things on that side as well to kind of mitigate ransomware, such as patch management, monitoring your antivirus status, being able to see everything on a single SaaS console, and just kind of touch base on that realm. Also monitoring your firewall. So at the end of the day, MSP 360 is going to cover, in terms of backup, all of the above: Windows, Linux, Macs. On the RMM side, we are Windows compatible. The Linux and Mac is going to be coming soon. But what we're trying to cover is everything that you and your clients end up using. We also have on-prem support for on-prem applications like SQL and Exchange, hosted solutions like Microsoft 365 or Google Apps, and then virtualization platforms like VMware, Hyper-V. If you're running any different on-prem applications, or rather virtual applications like Citrix, KVM, something of the like, we do have workarounds with those. It's just not out of the box. And again, yeah, just to kind of circle back to that, we do all monitoring is done from a single pane of glass SaaS console. So all of your backup jobs, all of your RMM statistics, remote desktop statistics, etc., will be done from one screen within our system. Kind of circle back what I had said previously as well. Again, we really don't dictate where you put the data. So we allow you to utilize the public storage landscape. You can, come up with these relationships, like on a proprietary basis with Wasabi directly, for example, or AWS Direct. We do also have billing options that are, coming through us, or essentially we streamline the billing process. We allow you to pay one bill through us. We take care of the backups. And then in terms of the storage, it's still managed on your end. Overall, just to kind of, touch on what some stuff that Christine was mentioning earlier regarding retention policy, it's fully customizable. So whether it's, a 30-day retention, or obviously we're seeing some more ransomware as of late that's, kind of embedding itself over time and piecemeal. That's kind of where the GFS methodology comes into play. The grandfather, father, son, keeping legacy backups for an extended period of time also help out with certain compliances depending on what you guys are looking for. And then client-side deduplication, obviously, is just going to keep overall data footprint relatively small. Typically, we see about a 30 to 35% data reduction, just obviously saving you a little bit of money on the back end. kind of outlining here, we're not selling you any private data center storage like a lot of the competition. Essentially, our goal, our end goal, essentially, is just to allow you safe, sturdy backups. It's your data. If you decide to leave us at any point in time, the data is still hosted in a public data center like AWS or something of the like. And utilizing one of their data centers, you're going to end up paying around 2 to 3 cents per gigabyte. It's like $23 a month per terabyte, just allowing you to pass that same savings on to your clients, or obviously margin even a little bit higher. So overall, that's going to be just a brief overview of the platform. Obviously, feel free to stop by our booth and ask us any questions that you may have. Again, right now, we're currently offering backup, remote desktop, and remote management as well. And I do believe we're giving away a Sonos 5-play speaker at the end of this presentation. So thanks for stopping by the presentation today, guys. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. It looks like, oh, okay, the question was answered in the chat on getting the presentation afterward. So good, thanks for that question. All right, so I think if there are no other questions here, oh, here, wait, we do have a question, let's see. And I think, Seth, this might be for you. So the question is, how do you all handle offline, offsite backups?
Regarding like the machine being offline or like an air-gapped environment?
Both.
The machine being offline, the machine would have to be online for us to take a backup of it. Regarding an air-gapped environment, our SaaS console really wouldn't come into play at that point. We do have a Cloudberry product line where it would strictly be agent-based, where it would be doable at that point. Obviously, all the backups would be local, but it would be something that would probably require bringing in some system engineers to discuss a little bit further. But that's how I see it playing out. It's just utilizing one of our like just agent-based applications.
Awesome, thank you for that. Okay, any other burning questions? No? Okay, all right. Well, I think we're ready for the giveaway. Remember, you gotta be present to win. So we'll see who's here. Okay, so virtual drum roll. For the Sonos Play 5, our winner is Andrew Torian. Andrew Torian. Are you here? Andrew? Oh, okay, it looks like I see Andrew on. Yay. Okay, congrats, you won. So the Veriano team will reach out with next time getting you that.
Hey, Christine, this
Oh,
is
no,
Kurt.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Hey guys, I'm the VP of Marketing for MSP 360. Andrew, I guess let me just drop my email address and you can email me your address, and as soon as I get it, I will mail the prize to you. So just hold on, just hang on for 1 minute before you log off.
All right, thanks for that, Kurt. And sorry,
That's okay.
Okay, all right. So yeah, cool, awesome. Well, we have our winner. I don't see any other questions coming through here. Oh, I see questions. Are we on LinkedIn? I know I am. I'm happy to drop mine in the chat real quick. I'll put this up. Yeah, if you have specific questions on MSP 360, of course, like feel free to reach out to the team. But yeah, this has been great. If you have questions, again, reach out. Thanks so much for joining this webinar. That concludes everything. Make sure that you scan the barcode from the phone. Also stop by the booths and things during the rest of the conference. And yeah, I hope everybody has a great evening. And thanks again for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot, guys. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.